Agenda for today. So we're going to start with our review of what biodiversity is and why it's important. And then to start our talk about spring practices, we are going to talk about the history of the lawn to kind of get an idea of why things are the way they are. And then we will talk about some of those essential spring practices, which include things like building bee homes, planting native plants, and avoiding pesticide use. Then we'll talk about planning for summer and how you can participate in some advocacy and outreach within your communities. So let's get started with that review. So what is biodiversity? So as we discussed in our first session, biodiversity is defined as the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem, which is a definition that was coined by American biologist E.O. Wilson. So we talked about how this term is very complex, and it's meant to include all of the plants, animals, fungi, and other organisms on our planet, which includes humans. But all of these organisms are continuously interacting in ways that we can't always see, which is why it's kind of a term that's a little bit hard to understand. So to get an idea of how big of a concept biodiversity is, scientists at National Geographic estimate that there are roughly 9 million species on planet Earth right now. But some scientists argue that this number is actually much higher, potentially as high as 100 million different species. But ultimately, we're unsure, which really just goes to show how diverse our planet really is. So why should we care about biodiversity? Without biodiversity, there would be nothing to support life on Earth, which includes humans. And unfortunately, biodiversity is rapidly decreasing. So biodiversity supports our food supply. It gives us fruitful agricultural practices. As I talked about in our first session, 1 in every 3 bites of food that you take was created by a pollinator. Biodiversity also improves the quality of our soil, which improves farming sustainability and the quality of our food, which allows us to rely on these systems. So biodiversity can also conserve and protect local watersheds. So organisms that live within our water break down excess nutrients, pollutants, and pathogens, which gives us cleaner, healthier water, not only for humans, but for other living organisms in aquatic ecosystems, along with species that eat these aquatic organisms. So biodiversity also helps to break down pollutants in our atmosphere and environment. So in the carbon cycle, for example, I've got an image of that on the screen here. But in the carbon cycle, trees and soil can remove carbon from our atmosphere, which removes or reduces the impacts of climate change. And another important benefit that is really important to us humans is that biodiversity or spending time in nature in general can improve our well-being. So humans that spend time in nature experience less feelings of depression and anxiety. Children who have more recreation time outdoors are known to have fewer behavioral problems, and access to a view of a green space at your workplace actually results in higher productivity. So another topic that we covered in our first session is this idea of cues to care. So this is kind of the overarching lens that we're using to talk about a lot of these concepts behind building for biodiversity. So to define cues to care, it's a term coined by Joe Nassauer. So the definition states to describe actions undertaken by humans that indicate a landscape is well cared for and meets cultural expectations for maintenance. So this is kind of making it evident that the choices you've made to your landscape are carefully planned additions. So maybe you're including signs or creating borders or adding additional architectural features to your landscape. And this idea is important for the content we're going to talk about today because pollinator gardens or rewilded areas don't necessarily fit into conventional standards for lawn or garden attractiveness. But cues to care helps to remind us that these messy areas of our yards are intentionally placed, and they're placed there with a purpose to benefit biodiversity. So we're going to talk about stylized rewilding in a little bit and how cues to care can help to show your neighbors that you're intentionally making a difference for biodiversity within your landscape. So what can we do to protect biodiversity in our yards and communities? So one of the biggest ideas, one of the most important things that you can do is follow the idea of less is more in terms of yard maintenance and landscaping. So this means less mowing, less fertilizing, less weeding, less sort of hands-on actions that are removing things from your environment. Another thing that you can do to protect biodiversity is begin the shift away from the modern lawn, which we're going to start talking about a little bit today, but we'll get into a lot more in our next few sessions. But shifting away from the modern lawn is a great way to care for biodiversity because the typical lawn made up of turf grass does not support a variety of organisms. So going along with this, reducing mowing frequency can also make a big difference for biodiversity. So implementing native plants in your garden is another great way to cater to local animals and insects because native plants provide them with the food and habitat that they're meant to eat and that they're meant to live in. We talked a little bit about the concept of rewilding, which is essentially selecting a portion of your yard and just letting things grow. So it kind of follows that idea of letting nature take care of yourself. It's sort of a hands-off approach that creates a wonderful environment for biodiversity. So going back to that idea of less is more, another thing that you can do to improve space for biodiversity at home is to avoid using pesticides or fertilizers. And we're going to talk more in depth about this today and kind of where the history of using pesticides comes from. Another thing to do to protect biodiversity is to remove invasive species. So we talked specifically about the Norway maple tree and the Bradford pear in our first session. So removing these species and replacing them with native alternatives is another great way to improve habitat and food supply for native pollinators and other animals. So another great way to care for biodiversity in your landscape is by beginning the transition to electric lawn care equipment. So you might start with using an electric snowblower in the winter, and then you might use an electric lawnmower in the spring and summer, or other electric tools like a chainsaw. And the thing that's great about this variety of tools is that you can use the same battery for all of them. We touched briefly on how you can get involved with local volunteer organizations to implement community gardens, but we're going to dive deeper into this idea of advocacy and outreach today to see how that can make a big impact in your community. So let's revisit this quote from Doug Tallamy, who's a professor of wildlife ecology and entomology at the University of Delaware. So Tallamy states the 4 ecological functions that all landscapes need to perform are 1, support a diverse and complex food web, 2, manage local watersheds, 3, move carbon from the atmosphere to the soil, and 4, provide food and housing for as many species of native bees as possible. So the lawn does none of these things well, so reducing the area we have in turf grass is a first logical step. So this quote is really important to the ideas we're going to talk about today because we are going to get started on talking about the history of the lawn. So the modern lawn originated in Europe, specifically Britain and France during the 1700s. And by modern lawn, I mean the space that you see outside of pretty much anybody's home, and especially in suburban areas. And these are areas that are made up of just like turf grass or short plants that are very green, and they're absent of weeds and any other sort of flowering plants. And the term lawn is derived from the word laud, which means a grassy woodland clearing. And during this time in the early 1700s, the first lawns were deliberately cultivated by the wealthy in these areas of Europe. And they were actually primarily made up of herbs like chamomile and thyme rather than grass like we see today. But early lawns were meant to be a status symbol for the upper class because of the amount of maintenance that they required. Hence why they were only found in or near homes of the wealthy. And the lawn was established far before technology was able to create a lawnmower. So grass and herb lawns essentially had to be either cut by hand or by using grazing methods. And both of these methods were very time consuming and very expensive. So by 1806, United States President Thomas Jefferson was the first American to replicate the European lawn at his home in Monticello. But soon after he made this shift, other wealthy landowners, American landowners, were starting to follow in his footsteps, like President George Washington, for example. He implemented a bowling green area or lawn area at his home in Mount Vernon. But during this time, although wealthy landowners were kind of making this shift, most American lawns weren't changing. They still existed as either vegetable, herb, or flower gardens instead of the monoculture grass that we see today. So by 1830, the first lawnmower was invented, and it was actually invented as an adaptation from a carpet cutter. And you can see the image on the screen here, but they look surprisingly similar to the lawnmowers of today. And the invention of the lawnmower really revolutionized lawns because the lawnmower really reduced the time demand in terms of lawn maintenance. And by 1868, this first lawnmower was patented. And despite the patent and an increased production of lawnmowers, they were still considered luxury items just due to their expense. And lawns were still typically maintained by the wealthy because lawnmowers just weren't accessible for the average American, and that maintenance by hand was too time consuming and expensive. So in the year 1870, author Frank J. Scott published his book, The Art of Beautifying Suburban Home Grounds. And in his book, Scott actually states, a smooth, closely shaven surface of grass is by far the most essential element of beauty on the grounds of a suburban home. So this really plays into that idea that still, a long time after lawns originated, they're still continuing to exist as a status symbol now in the United States. So by 1871, the first lawnmower sprinkler, or the lawn sprinkler system, was patented. And this patent allowed for homeowners to install in-ground sprinkler systems to water their lawns. And this was also very expensive. So still perpetuating that division of lawns only for wealthier people. But shortly after the sprinkler system was patented, there were a lot of concerns arising from a lot of people over drought and excess or unnecessary water use, which is still something that we see today. So also around this time, around the mid 1870s, gardens were actually shifting to the backyard. So when Thomas Jefferson was the first American to implement the European lawn, like I said, most American yards were still made up of vegetable, herb, and flower gardens, but slowly around this time, these elements were starting to shift to backyard spaces, so front yards could be occupied just by lawns, and lawns were being considered a barrier between homes and streets as suburban communities were slowly beginning to form. So also in this time in the mid-19th century, we were starting to see parks pop up across the United States. And these are pretty similar to the parks of today. They were characterized by lawns, which are made up of turf grass, a variety of trees, shrubbery, and water. And they were actually modeled after British estate grounds. So they were trying to look very high class and luxurious. So by 1876, we see this idea of grass to the masses. So the United States Department of Agriculture started bringing lawn growing displays to a variety of events. They were showing people how to start lawns, but they weren't telling them how to maintain them, which was resulting in a lot of failure and a lot of wasted space as the open areas around people's homes it was failing grass year after year without anything that was able to cater to biodiversity. And some of these experts that were showing people how to start lawns were actually recommending that they start over year after year after year when implementation of lawns failed. So the modern lawn was really starting to take hold in America as a standard at this time. So to go off of that idea, by 1880, lawn care articles were becoming very popular in United States magazines. So the popularity of lawns was soaring along with that, and homeowners began to focus more and more on the grass around their homes. So by 1888, the first golf course was established in New York, and this was very influential in terms of lawns. So golf was increasing in popularity at the same time that golf course-like lawns were becoming a new American goal. So people wanted to have really short cut lawns that mimicked a golf course essentially. And golf created the first practical use for turf grass. I have to say that in quotations because it doesn't support biodiversity, but it creates a purpose for a lawn that's not just a status symbol. And other games like lawn bowling were also increasing in popularity at this time. So also playing into that desire for a really short-cut turf grass-like lawn. So by the early 1900s, because of the popularity in golf, the United States Golf Association was pouring money into research on potential lawn and turf grasses. So a lot of this money was going to the United States Department of Agriculture to find more lawn alternatives and better ways to establish lawns. So during this time, in the early 1900s, a green manicured lawn was becoming part of the American dream. But by 1918, lawn desires were put on hold with World War I. Lawn spaces were turned into victory gardens in a lot of communities, and even the White House lawn changed shape. It was used to raise sheep, to free up groundskeepers for military services, and then so that those sheep could be used to raise wool for the Red Cross. So by the 1920s, the expectation of lawn beautification was becoming a standard. Homeowners were expected to maintain and beautify their front yards for the sake of passersby. So lawns were still persisting as a status symbol because many people like factory workers, southern tenement farmers, and sharecroppers didn't actually have front yards or a space where they could have a lawn. So this idea of lawn as important was continuing into the 1930s, and the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 had a lot of influence on this as well. It set the precedent for the 40-hour work week, which gave a lot of individuals and their family recreation time on the weekends where they could spend time in their yard, they could play games in their yard, but they could also spend the weekend time on lawn maintenance and improvement. And this was put on hold during World War II in the 1940s, but post-war efforts really returned Americans to their lawn obsessions. And by the late 1940s, lawnmower sales were skyrocketing. Rotary lawnmowers were increasing in popularity and production, which made lawn maintenance more popular for the middle class. So in the 1950s and 1960s, suburban populations were growing really quickly, which was also increasing the popularity of lawns. So Levittown was the first American suburb that had lawns in place already when the tenants were first moving into this community. So the suburb heavily was promoting lawn care in its regular newsletter. So it was constantly reminding residents the importance of a neat, weed-free, shortcut lawn. And this is still seen into today. I mean, I know my city and a lot of other cities in Minneapolis, I'm sure it's the same in the Massachusetts area as well, but a lot of cities have ordinances in terms of grass height or the type of plants that you can plant in your yard. And by the 1960s, the lawn and garden industry was booming. There was a lot of development going towards new grass seed technology. Also during this time, fertilizer and pesticide use was becoming commonplace. So pesticides were used to remove weeds and crabgrass. And something interesting that I found about this is that until the 1950s, clover was actually considered a natural and acceptable part of lawns, which is interesting because that is something that's now included in bee lawn mixes very commonly. But clover is awesome because it fixes nitrogen in the soil and it improves soil quality while providing food for pollinators. But in the late 1960s, when pesticides were becoming commonplace, it was discovered that pesticides remove clover the same way that they remove dandelions. So a lot of people made the conclusion that if this pesticide is removing clover, it must also be a weed. So from that point on, it was considered a weed and pesticides were used to remove it. So by the 1970s and 1980s, the United States Department of Agriculture and other universities were diving into lawn research. So they were beginning research programs for home lawns and grasses. And during this time, lawn maintenance services were also really growing in popularity. So by the 1990s and 2000s, I like to consider this the era of turf grass breeding. So this was becoming the norm that was pushing new options for grass and things to plant in your lawn. These ideas were being pushed out to consumers really quickly. So the lawn evolution has gotten us to this point. This is what most modern lawns look like today, just that big green space of grasses. So the lawn evolved from a symbol of British wealth to a symbol of the American dream for the middle class. And even today, lawns are still seen as socioeconomic indicators of neighborhoods or communities. According to an article from Scientific American, a properly maintained lawn tells others that you are a good neighbor. So it's still playing into that idea of lawns say something about who you are as a member of your neighborhood or community. But now we're starting to see a bit of a push towards lawn alternatives. So the lawn as we know it today doesn't necessarily support biodiversity. It's really just an open space that doesn't really serve as a home or food for a variety of plants and animals. So we're going to go through a list of harms from a forest ecologist named F. Herbert Borman and his colleagues in this book that I have on the screen called Redesigning the American Lawn. So first, a lawnmower pollutes as much as 1 hour, as does driving an automobile for 350 miles. So lawns themselves don't cater to biodiversity, but lawn maintenance practices like using a gas-powered lawnmower can do even more harm to our planet. So lawnmowers are actually very inefficient in burning fuel, and 30% of their engine fuels fail to undergo complete combustion, meaning that they're spewing out more air pollutants. So switching to electric lawn care equipment like electric lawnmowers can eliminate some of this harm, or foregoing mowing altogether. So going along with this, 580 million gallons of gasoline are used for lawnmowers each year. So this relates directly to the previous point. Lawnmowers are just inherently pretty wasteful, and making the switch to electric lawn care, if you are able, can greatly reduce personal consumption of gas and oil. And this statistic of 580 million gallons is just for the United States. So globally, this number is likely a lot higher. But I do understand that the switching to electric lawn care is not something that's feasible for everybody, as it can be a bit expensive. Although when it is something that you can afford, it's great because those batteries can be used for every season. So as I mentioned, another thing that you can do is just avoid mowing when possible. So 30 to 60% of urban freshwater is used for watering lawns, depending on the city. So having a green manicured lawn requires a lot of water. Lawns are considered wasteful in drought-prone places like California or other areas in the desert due to their lawn requirements. So the picture on the screen on the right shows a desert golf course, and I think it's just kind of interesting to look at the contrast between how green and manicured that golf course is compared to the rest of the landscape and how much water that took. So it's kind of important to think about how long can we sustain this? How long can we sustain the lawn? And how long can we afford this? Because constantly watering your lawn to meet societal standards can be really expensive. So over $5 billion per year is spent on fossil fuel derived fertilizers for US lawns. So first, fertilizers make your grass look green and manicured, but they have a lot of negative repercussions on our environment that you don't necessarily see. So fertilizers can run off into local water supplies, which harm water quality and aquatic organisms, and therefore the rest of the food chain. So 67 million pounds of synthetic pesticides are used on US lawns each year. So pesticides are also incredibly harmful to our native ecosystems, as they can kill insects and plants other than what is being targeted by the pesticides. And that can also harm the health of other animal species. Pesticides also harm us. We can look to the lawsuit against the company Monsanto, as there was a link drawn between cancer and the herbicide Roundup. So pesticides are harmful to our health and especially the health of our pets too. So most grasses like Kentucky bluegrass, which is what is found in most lawns, actually came from other parts of the world and have been naturalized in the US. So we talked a lot about invasive species in our first session, and Kentucky bluegrass is actually not native to the United States. But since the lawn has really been established as the norm here now, it's naturalized here. So it's not something that would naturally grow here, but it does now because we've brought it here. And because it's not native here, it doesn't necessarily cater to biodiversity. So let's talk about some lawn alternatives. So there's so many alternatives to turf grass that could better serve biodiversity, yet still allow for recreation in your lawn. So the first is the bee lawn, which we talked about a little bit last time, and we'll get into more in the future. Another option, which is what we've been doing at my parents' house, is having no lawn, just plants. Our entire front yard is mostly just plants. There's very little grass. Another idea is following the concept of xeriscaping, which is eliminating the need for water use in your yard or garden. Another possibility is implementing ornamental native grasses. So these are really big, showy grasses that are catering better to biodiversity than the traditional lawn does. A moss lawn is another alternative. Creeping Charlie can be used, although this one's a little controversial because it spreads really, really fast. Creeping thyme and chamomile are other options, and these were what we're seeing in those really early lawns in the 1700s. And then clover and Dutch clover are other lawn alternatives, and these are typically part of the bee lawn seed mixes. So the best time to plant a lawn alternative is actually the fall. And I know we're talking about spring and summer today, but I wanted to kind of get started on this, plant the seed in your head in terms of thinking about lawn alternatives, because it's kind of a big commitment to make that change. So something good to start thinking about now if you're considering a lawn alternative. And then we'll talk more about actual implementation of these things in future sessions. So we talked about how to plan for spring in our first session. So let's talk about how to put these spring plans into action. So the first concept, and probably the most pertinent since we're getting to springtime, is no mow May, or no mow early spring. So Nick and I talked about how this idea kind of differs depending on what part of the country you're in. So I'm in Minnesota. It snowed today. We're probably not going to start seeing flowers come up until May, but in Massachusetts, it's probably getting a little bit warmer already. So you want to avoid mowing once it starts getting warmer and flowers are able to start to bloom. So I like to think about it in the sense that if it's warm enough for your spring allergies to start showing, it's probably warm enough for the bees and the flowers to start coming out. So no mow May or no mow early spring is important for a lot of different reasons. So this is the time when the flowers are starting to bloom, and the flowers are typically like the first signs of food for pollinators. And mowing can risk taking away that food from pollinators, especially in urban areas where food supplies for pollinators are already limited. Pollinators also begin to emerge in the early spring as well. So most bees are actually solitary bees. And this means that they don't live in colonies or groups like honeybees or bumblebees do. And solitary bees typically lay their eggs at the end of the fall. And then the bees die, their eggs will survive the winter and then hatch in the spring. So early in the spring, pollinators are actually emerging from where they've been resting over the winter. And I've got a couple pictures of some solitary bees on the screen here. And queen bumblebees are also another species of bee that you might see emerging in the spring. So the queen bumblebee is actually the only bee the only bumblebee that survives the winter. So they have a sort of like antifreeze in their blood that helps them survive the harsh temperatures, along with them going 6 feet underground. So when the temperatures start to get warm again, the queens will then come out and then start laying their eggs to build the colony for the season. So along with this idea of solitary bees, a potential practice to implement during the spring is building homes for these bees. So while you're doing observations for spring, as we talked about using your home as your research station, pay attention to any solitary bees that you might see, because building homes for them is an option to do during the spring. So these are just like birdhouses, but for bees. So the easiest way to make a bee home is to use a bundle of sticks. So you just need to gather some hollow sticks or reeds, bundle them up, and then put them where bees can find them. So these tunnels or sticks should be open on one end and then closed on the other, because this prevents parasites and pathogens. The sticks chosen should be about 1/8 of an inch to 1/2 an inch in diameter, and then the bundles should be kept about 3 to 5 feet off the ground. So nests or these homes should also be switched out every 2 years to also help prevent invasion from parasites and pathogens, as these can be really harmful to bee populations. So another option for building bee homes is included on the right side of the screen, which is using a wood block and a drill. So you can also drill in holes to a large wood block that are 1/8 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch in diameter. I do want to add a word of caution here, though. There are a lot of bee homes that are available online for solitary bees, but a lot of these are made of bamboo. And with my experience at the Bee Lab and what Nick and I have found in our research is that bamboo is not good for bees, especially mason bees. Bamboo can collect a lot of moisture, which can be harmful to bees. And also, bamboo is simply just not a native material. It's not something that's native to the US. It's not something that bees would naturally nest in. So if you choose to buy some sort of bee home for your yard, definitely avoid bamboo. So let's talk a little bit about planting native plants. So there's a lot of different things you can do in your landscape to improve habitat for biodiversity, and planting native is one of the biggest things. So you might choose to plant small pockets of habitat, like having just a small section of native plants. You might choose to remove invasive species and implement native ones, or maybe you're thinking about doing a lawn or planting some sort of lawn alternative. But planting native plants is likely the easiest. So in our first session, I talked about something to do in planning for spring is to evaluate your landscape to determine how much sun and how much shade you have. And this will give you an idea of what kind of plants you might want to implement in your yard. And having small pockets of garden in various areas in your yard can be just as good for pollinators as having one big garden. So if you want to plant in just the sunny areas, that can be just as beneficial. So I have on this slide a screenshot from a planting guide from the Minnesota DNR that walks you through a step-by-step process of planting for biodiversity at home. So this specific guide, which I have in our resources document, talks about Minnesota plants, but the guide in terms of planting, the principles are the same. So it's also important to remember that you want to implement plants in your garden that are growing throughout the entire season. So this is important to keep in mind for your summer planning. So some native plants for you to consider. So you want to plant perennial species that are coming back from year after year, because this will reduce the amount of maintenance time and also adds continuous benefits for biodiversity. Another thing that you want to keep in mind is that if you are planting, you want to do so in the spring, because plants shouldn't be moved when it gets really hot in the summer. So here's a couple of options, some native plants that are native to the New England area. So wild geranium is something that blooms early in the season and is great for pollinators. The swamp milkweed will bloom in the middle of the summer. And then the calico aster is another flowering plant species that blooms later in the season. So these three plants came from a great resource from the Xerces Society, which is included in our resources document, that lists out a lot of native species to the New England area that bloom at all times of the year. And the resource also has information on water and sun requirements, along with a variety of shrubs. So it's a great resource to look to if you're wondering what plants might suit your landscape. So I'm just going to touch briefly on using compost in your yard. But you can implement about 1 to 2 inches of compost into your garden beds to improve the soil quality. And you want to implement this compost about 1 to 2 weeks before planting, as this is how the benefits are mostly used by the plant species. So another big key point is avoid using pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. So these are chemicals that are designed to remove certain pests, fungi, or other insects that are inhibiting with your garden. So they sound like they're well-intentioned, but they're actually really, really harmful to pollinators and should be avoided to protect biodiversity and you. However, if you absolutely 100% have to use pesticides, which I hope you don't, but I understand in certain instances, if you're trying to grow vegetables and you're having an issue with some sort of pest, you might have to use a pesticide. So what you want to do in that rare instance is take a look at the bottle and look at how toxic that pesticide might be to bees. Sometimes it'll say on the bottle, or you can find that information online usually. You also want to follow the instructions very carefully on the bottle because a lot of them actually recommend dilution. So diluting the product prevents the toxic chemicals from sticking around in the environment for too long. And spraying pesticides at night also reduces harmful impacts to pollinators and other animal species. Again, only if you absolutely have to use pesticides, which I hope is rare. So we're going to move on to talk about stylized rewilding, or the idea of a hipster haircut. So we talked a little bit about rewilding in our last session, how it's essentially the idea of letting nature take care of itself. So picking an area in your yard and kind of just letting things go. So we have talked about this as a hipster haircut because it's sort of messy, but it's still organized. So rewilded areas might be considered messy by your neighbors, as the grass is becoming overgrown and weeds might start to pop up. But to avoid these negative comments, this is where this idea of cues to care comes in. So maybe you're trying to, if you're trying to avoid comments from your neighbors, maybe you're choosing to rewild in your backyard where you know that you're benefiting biodiversity, but you don't have to worry as much about those conversations. Or maybe you want to put signs in your yard that show your neighbors or members of your community that the choices you've made in your landscape are intentional to benefit biodiversity. Or maybe you want to implement architectural aspects like Japanese stone gardens that can be put in to allow the grass to grow in cooler shapes. And it's important to remember that it's your yard to experiment with, and you can do whatever you want, especially when you are trying to benefit biodiversity. So let's talk a little bit about how to plan for summer. So as I mentioned, you likely want to do most of your planting in the springtime just because of the way that the soil is and the way that plants adjust. But there are still some things that you might want to do in terms of maintenance and planning for summer. So the first thing that I'm sure comes to most people's mind is summer yard and garden maintenance. So the best approach to summer yard and garden maintenance is to take as much of a hands-off or less is more approach as possible. This is the idea of kind of like letting nature take care of itself. And it's important to remember that the concept of weeds is one that's man-made. These plants that are considered weeds are actually very beneficial to pollinators and other types of biodiversity. People just tend to not like the way that they look. But if you're trying to take a gradual approach to rewilding or planting for pollinators, you might decide to weed occasionally in your garden, but that's really about the extent of the maintenance that you'll need to do. In terms of checking out your yard, you might want to check your garden or landscape for the growth of any invasive species. Maybe you're seeing a Norway maple sprout, or maybe you're seeing some other sort of invasive plant, but you want to keep an eye on those to make sure that they can be removed and aren't causing more damage to the whole ecosystem. So playing along with this idea of minimal maintenance, the less you mow, the better. But I know, as I've mentioned, a lot of cities have ordinances in terms of lawn height, and some people have to keep their lawns within a certain height to avoid paying a fee to their city. So if this is you and you're concerned about this, you can adjust your lawnmower cutting height to allow the grass to remain as long as possible. So also with maintenance, you can reduce watering by adding mulch to your garden, as this can help to absorb and retain moisture in your garden spaces. So using iNaturalist or keeping a regular nature journal are another great way to plan for summer. You might want to go pick up a nature journal. I have this one that's on the screen. It's called Write in the Rain. So the paper is waterproof and you can get a waterproof pen. So then if you want to go outside while it's raining and make some observations, you can do that. But we talked about iNaturalist last week, which is an app that's used to keep track of observations, where the data is then used by scientists to monitor populations or understand biodiversity in the area. But something that's really awesome about iNaturalist and nature journaling is it helps you stay in touch with nature and the type of biodiversity that you're seeing in your landscape. We talked about how we, as humans, we live in a built environment, so we're kind of disconnected from that, and observations and nature journaling can help you get back in touch with that, and also can show you how to just enjoy your yard and your space, because as I said, it's your space. You can do whatever you want with it. So to plan for summer, plan to do nothing. Nick and I joked that lazy is the new green, and that doing nothing is a sort of environmental inactivism, because we've talked about how doing less is more in terms of how to improve space for biodiversity. So summer is a great time to kind of take that hands-off approach to allow your yard to rewild, and also to just enjoy time outdoors. You don't always have to be doing something. So in terms of summer planning, another great thing to do is to work with local volunteer organizations to work on community gardens. So a community garden is defined as a piece of land gardened or cultivated by a group of people individually or collectively. So the benefits to both biodiversity and humans greatly expand when habitats pop up in many areas within a city. So maybe you have a garden of native plants in your yard, and maybe your neighbors down the street do too. Maybe there's one in the park in your neighborhood, but maybe there's also one in the city center. The more gardens in one community can increase the amount of food and habitat for pollinators specifically. So community gardens are a really great way to spread the benefits of biodiversity within your community. So to talk about advocacy, I just want to touch briefly on a project that I worked on last fall. So as I mentioned, I'm a senior at the University of Minnesota. So for my capstone, I worked with a small group of other students as consultants to the city of West St. Paul in Minnesota to help design a plan for redesigning their right-of-ways. So a right-of-way is an area that you see either in a median or alongside a roadway. And the recommendations that my group came up with for this community is that native plants are the perfect options for these areas. So native plants are actually really hardy and they can withstand harsh conditions of winter, especially because they're native, they're built for that. But they can also withstand road salts and require minimal maintenance. So they lessen requirements by the city, but they also improve the quality of the ecosystem and improve habitats for wildlife while still maintaining that aesthetic quality that people love to see. So I'm bringing this up because I'm just going to touch a little bit on advocacy because this is something you can do in your community. If you're interested in improving biodiversity beyond just your yard, you could consider proposing to your city a plan to implement native plants in the right-of-ways. So to wrap up here, we're just going to touch on the idea of advocacy and outreach. So Bill McKibben, who's the founder of 350, he does a lot of work on climate change, a lot of writing, a lot of advocacy, but he argues that 1/3 of your time should be spent doing advocacy and outreach. So as much time as you're taking to spend changing the plants in your yard, implementing native plants or rewilding, you want to spend some time doing advocacy as well, because the benefits to biodiversity increase when they're beyond just one area. So maybe you want to consider writing to your local city council members, explaining why you think native plants should be in your city. You might want to tell them about the benefits of them being hardy, low maintenance, and still beautiful while being beneficial for pollinators. You might want to attend a city council meeting to argue these same ideas. You could also consider connecting with local volunteer groups to implement community gardens. And you could pitch these ideas to your city council to say, hey, how can we implement more community gardens and more native plants? So I'm in Minnesota, so I'm working with Nick remotely, but he's told me that there's a lot of Bradford pears like in and around the Boston area, and these are invasive trees. So maybe you want to consider connecting with your city council to say, hey, why do we have these invasive species? What can we do to remove the invasives and implement something native? Because implementing native plants, as I've reiterated so many times, can have so many benefits for pollinators and animals. You could also ask about rewilding a section of a local park and implementing those signs about cues to care, because that will kind of get the ball rolling in terms of changing the norms of yards and landscapes. You could also organize a local park cleanup or some sort of outreach events. The picture that I have on the screen here is from myself and 2 of my colleagues from the B Lab doing an outreach event, but you want to talk to members of your community, get involved with your community, and let people know the benefits of biodiversity and the things that you can do to change your landscape. Okay, so that was a lot of information. I know we went through that pretty quickly just because there was so much we wanted to condense in there, but we will take some time for questions now. So feel free to put them in the chat or shout them out. I'll put the link to the resources document in the chat as well.
Great job, Elise. I'm fired up to go do some biodiversity right now. It's 7:49 and I'm ready to go back out into the okay, there's some questions in the chat box for you. Do you want to read those? Do you want me to read them off?
Yeah, let's see. Pesticides and herbicides were a byproduct of chemical warfare in World War II. Chemical industry was heavily stocked with these dangerous chemicals, so they promoted their use despite their obvious dangers. Yeah, pesticides, I mean, are really, they're now, I mean, mostly used by like large industrial agriculture, but yeah, they have more negatives than they do positives for sure.
Oh, and one thing on that, so something that's people might not be aware of is that the PFAs they're finding in all the water systems. So in the packaging that the insect, so during the Triple E scare in Massachusetts, the packaging that held the insecticides leached polyfluoroalkylates into the insecticides, which are forever chemicals. And now certain, like tons of towns around Massachusetts have polluted water, like Wayland has to give out bottled water. So in trying to get rid of insects, which would have supported some other form of biodiversity like birds, we've now poisoned our own water. So
Yeah.
not only is it just the insecticides in our yards, our cities and towns and states are dumping insecticides. So it's, yeah, if you want to read about PFAs in the water, there's a lot of Boston Globe articles on them.
Yeah, we've got PFAS issues in Minneapolis too with 3M. PFAS is found in everything. I mean, it's found in like the coatings of Teflon pans and like non-slip shoes and I can't remember what it's called, but like the material that like raincoats are made out of that are like water resistant, but it's found everywhere and it's really harmful to water.
Okay, there's a question here. Have you heard of Pearl's Premium, a seed from New England? Does not need to be mowed much, it's watered much, and it has more indigenous grass. Are you familiar with that one?
No, I'm not. And it sounds to me like that's a New England native, which I know this is like the doing a presentation on planting native and not being from New England is like a bit of a barrier here. So because most of my knowledge is on Minnesota native plants, but I can for sure look into that. Nick and I are going to meet with someone that I've worked with who does a lot of work on developing seed mixes for bee lawns, and he's from the East Coast, so I'm sure he knows about it and we could probably learn a little bit more about it that way.
Okay, and do you recommend rain gardens?
Yes, I don't know a ton about rain gardens, but I know when they're done right, they have a lot of benefits.
So we're building our first house with a rain garden now, so there's no gutters on the house. The water falls off the roof. It goes into a piping underground. It's covered in stones, and then that water, instead of draining into underground systems or going into the city's stormwater system, it goes to like a part of the yard where there's a lot of plants that will soak up the water. So it's a way to sort of get the rainwater back into the surface plants. So yeah, rain gardens are a great way to use the water that's on your roof and then water the areas without causing flooding around the house.
Yep.
Okay, you discussed no mow May. I like this idea, but there's an indicator other than the date when I should start mowing again. So I think you spoke to that, but do you want to touch base?
Yeah, typically a good guide is wait until after Memorial Day weekend. So if you have to mow, I would wait until after Memorial Day weekend. That's usually once things have started to establish and it's a little bit better of a time.
Okay, question from Eileen. She says, Pachysandra is prevalent in our area. Is it not a good plant to have as a naturalizer on your property? It spreads on our property, but never to a great degree.
I don't know anything about that plant.
I think Pachysandra is a ground cover that spreads pretty quickly. I don't know much about it, but we can look up on iNatural about it, or we can
put something in our resources document about that. I'll write that down.
Pachysandra question. Okay. And then Bob says, I kept a compost pile for many years, but recently we've had rats show up on our property. Any thoughts on how to keep a compost pile but avoid rats?
So I know some people have had issues with like maggots or rats or things like that getting into their compost. I know some of those issues arise when people put like meat specifically in their compost, because that can be more attractive to pests like rats sometimes. I have a friend who uses like a really large, like old garbage can. So it's like the same material that like your garbage can is. And those are usually a little bit more, it creates more of a barrier between animals and the compost that you're working on generating.
Yeah, I have two different bins that I use too. I have a metal one. I think it's made by Bergen. I think it's BERG. It's a galvanized bin with holes, but it's also lifted off the ground about 3 inches and it has a metal lid. Whereas the other one that I use for like yard stuff sits right on the ground, so some animals could get into that. So there are, and you can also do there's also different types of compost bins that are up off the ground, like tumbler composts, and so
Yep.
yeah. So there's a few other ways that you could to do that if you're worried about rodents.
Yep.
Lisa wrote that Pachysandra is not native to the Northeast. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Feel free to people who want to unmute themselves, turn on the cameras, ask questions. If there's things that people would like to hear about, Elisa is working on. The next 2 sessions have yet to be drafted yet. So if there's things people would like to see touched upon, Elisa, I was thinking it might be cool to show some models about what rewilding in parks would look like. You know,
yeah.
All what I've been trying out, and all you really need to rewild areas is just some stakes and some string, and then just to see what happens. And I think creating geometric patterns too, so it looks really intentional, would look kind of cool, like, you know, squares, like having, or circles, you know.
The hipster haircut.
Yeah, or the hipster haircut. Yeah. Well, what grows in there will grow wild, but I'm saying having it look really intentional with the shapes that are formed.
Yeah.
Putting human or cat hair in compost is said to repel rats. I don't know if that's valid.
I've heard that people have had success with this. In my parents' garden, we had like a ridiculous rabbit problem a few years ago. I mean, the rabbits ate like everything, like the hosta that was in our yard. It looked like someone had taken a machete to the ground. So we were trying a lot of like natural ways to keep the rabbits from eating absolutely everything. But I've heard that people have had like success with putting human or animal hair in their gardens. And I think with like the cat hair or dog hair, even, for example, it's just like that scent is there, and that can help to deter rats or bunnies or any sort of animal that's trying to mess with your compost.
Okay. I haven't heard that one. That's interesting.
Yeah. Any other tips for creating bee-friendly habitat? So the biggest thing that you can do is really planting native plants. I mean, that's kind of the message that we try to put out to people at the university, at the Bee Squad where I work, is that planting native is the biggest thing you can do. Oh, do they need water? Yes, actually, you can create bee baths, which is like a bird bath, but it's like really shallow. Like if you want to take a rock that has some sort of like divot in it, and just put a teeny little bit of water in there, bees will actually like rest in that space and drink from that water. That's a good question.
Bee spa.
Yeah. Yep. Oh, and before I forget, I'm going to put the resource document in the chat, which we'll also have posted to the website. But there's a ton of links in there in terms of the things that I talked about last session and this session if you're trying to get more information. And I also have my email address in there too.
Okay, so thank you for joining us. And Aaron will be posting this on the studio website. So if you tuned in late, or if you had somebody signed up and couldn't make it, hopefully we'll see you for the next one. Elise, what's the date on the next one?
April 20th, I believe. Let's check here. Yep, April 20th.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us, and good luck building for biodiversity. Use your yard as a research station. Try it out. And don't worry about what your neighbors. What I think to myself when I'm trying out some new crazy things is, when my neighbors pay my taxes, they can tell me what to do with my yard. But so long as I'm paying my taxes, I'm entitled to do whatever I want in my yard.
Correct.
With plantings. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Well, thanks for attending, everybody. I hope to see all of you at our next session.